Up next, we continue our look back at the Democratic presidential hopefuls in Election 88. We now bring you a July 1987 speech by former candidate Bruce Babbit at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to welcome my fellow club members and their guests who are in the audience today, as well as those of you who are listening to this program over one of the 335 national public radio stations or watching on one of the 2,500 cable systems affiliated with C-SPAN, the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network. Before going much further, I would like to remind our members of some coming events in this ballroom. Tomorrow, July 31st, our luncheon speaker will be humorist Victor Borge. And our future luncheon guests include the chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, M. Danny Wall, on August 6th, the executive director of the National Football League Players Association, Mr. Gene Upshaw, on August 25th, education secretary and hopeful presidential candidate in some minds, William Bennett, on September 8th, Swedish Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson on September 10th, and yet another presidential hopeful, Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, on September 23rd. I'd like to remind those of you in the audience that if you have any questions for our speaker today, to please write them on the cards that are on your table and pass them to the front. I'll ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce the guests at our head table. I ask them each to rise when I call their name, and for the audience to please hold their applause until all have been introduced. From my left is Joel Nilsen of the Arizona Republic, James Dwinell of Campaign Elections Magazine. He's the member of our speakers committee who organized today's luncheon. Stand up here. Greg Schneider's a partner in the Hamilton, Frederick, and Schneider's consulting firm. Gil Klein of Media General Newspapers, who is the chairman of the club's speakers committee. Ann Hoy of the Arizona Republic. And Bob Newman, the administrative assistant to Congressman Morris Udall of Arizona. And stealthily taking his seat over there is Sean Griffith. He gets his own entrance. After the 1976 presidential election, Arizona Congressman Morris Udall liked to tell dinner audiences that thanks to him and Senator Barry Goldwater, mothers in Arizona were the only ones in America who could no longer tell their children that they could grow up to be president. By the accounts of many political pundits today, our guest, former Governor Bruce Babbit of Arizona, has a long way to go before he changes that theory. One of the first Democrats to formally enter the race, Babbit remains near the bottom of many of the presidential name identification polls. He was one of the first Democrats to borrow money against future fundraising. And by other accounts, he was the only Democrat to lose ground after the 7 current candidates debated in Houston earlier this month. But underlining those early and somewhat superficial measurements is the feeling that only Babbit has laid out new ideas on issues such as health care for children, daycare vouchers, improving U.S. relations with its Latin American neighbors. Perhaps because of that, the candidate has nowhere to go but up. Babbit is a third generation of a pioneer Arizona family, and that spirit is evident in many of his positions and his political stands. He was elected Attorney General of Arizona in 1974 and became governor of the state in March 1978 upon the death of Governor Wesley Bolin. He was elected to his own first full-year term later that year and re-elected in 1982 with 63% of the vote. Some national Democrats had hoped Babbit would run for the Senate seat being vacated by Goldwater, but instead, Babbit, along with his bicycle, immediately headed to Iowa, setting the groundwork of an organization some say is the best in that state with the important first presidential caucuses. The next president must bear to be different, Governor Babbit said in March when he officially entered the race. Since then, he has called for the full taxing of federal benefits, including Social Security payments, means testing for some federal benefits, elimination of tax deductions for second homes, and other things. There has been some good news along the way. The governor and another former governor, Pierre DuPont, who is a Republican, were the first to debate in Iowa earlier this year, drawing strong and positive reviews for both of their performances. Governor Babbitt's early airing of television ads in Iowa turned out to be a lucky stroke, coming in the wake of Gary Hart's withdrawal from the presidential race. He was well received in his speech to the Americans for Democratic Action earlier this year, and with some key supporters on board in Iowa, the road to the White House, although getting shorter, seems at least less windy as well for him. Today, Governor Babbitt plans to put into detail his new proposal, a 5% federal consumption tax, suggestion just made that has been greeted by almost universal coldness. I would like to introduce now Governor of Arizona, Bruce Babbit.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. I must tell you, I thought that introduction was never going to end. I'm pleased to be with you today, and in my first press club appearance, I have tried to lay out an economic program that is at least newsworthy. It began leaking in Iowa earlier this week. I couldn't resist the temptation to speak to the Iowa press, and the introductions are a little better there, by the way.
I'm trying to give you a variety. I didn't want you to say it's the best introduction I've ever had.
There is no danger, whatever. America, as I see it today, is at the threshold of unprecedented economic change. The causes of that change are global, and I think the consequences far-reaching and dramatic. Because I believe that those changes that are now in progress will bring enormous opportunities, opportunities which we can seize and prosper from, or opportunities which we can squander. Because we've reached, in my judgment, one of those rare turning points, excuse me, in history, the end of an economic era and the beginning, just beginning to take shape of its successor. It happened here at home between the two world wars when Franklin D. Roosevelt first put capitalism into harness. And it happened abroad in the 1940s at Bretton Woods and after, when America and its allies launched a true global economy with a new set of rules for trade and investment. The foundations that we built then in the 1930s and 40s have served us long and well. They supported half a century of American global leadership and decades of growth and prosperity. Even today, there are encouraging signs. Inflation is under control. The stock market is booming. Yet, beneath that surface, many Americans sense that our prosperity is insecure. We all know that we're living on borrowed money, from budget deficit to trade deficit, and that one day we will have to pay all of that money back. We fear that something is out of kilter in a recovery that leaves whole regions and industries in distress. And we see as clear as day that we're falling behind our competitors in the quality of our products, in our efficiency at producing them, and in the share that we hold of markets around the world. In short, the institutions and habits of 50 years are beginning to fail us. They're not responding as they should to the challenges of change. We are a great and powerful nation, but we're not immune to the tides of history. And great and powerful nations have come and gone before. If we cling too fast to those old ways, we risk becoming a more divided and a less generous society, and a more vulnerable one, too. Because with the erosion of our economic might comes a progressive loss of control over the sources of our security. Now, none of this will happen tomorrow or all at once, because the wages of inaction are paid slowly. But we are left as a society with a choice. We can turn inward, away from our new global challenges, shut out the world, look back to the past, and settle slowly into a period of long decline. Or we can turn our economy outward, embracing change, building new habits and new institutions, and leading the world again. That's what this nation must decide in the 1988 presidential election. And that is the reason that I am running for President of the United States. I want to lead a dynamic America that meets and conquers the challenges of change, that builds an opportunity economy of unlimited potential for our children. And I deeply believe that the next president must guide us through a transformation in the way that we do business, both at home and abroad. And I think the American people are ready for that kind of change, and that they deserve leaders who know how to make it happen. And in my judgment, we must be guided by three considerations. First, how do we earn rather than borrow a higher standard of living? Second, how do we ensure that all Americans share in the benefits of that change? Third, how does this generation build an economy which makes life better, not just for us, but for the next generation? My answer, and the program that I will offer through the course of this campaign, rests on two powerful ideas. One is called the global growth economy. We all recognize increasingly that our economic future depends on the prosperity of the entire world economy. And we must recognize that the world economy is ready to come our way. Political freedom and market economics are on the rise, from South Korea to South America. And they must have American leadership so that we can all flourish together. And that means the next president must say no to protectionism and instead forge new trade agreements which expand trade instead of contracting it. And the next president must lead the way to restructuring of the burden of debt that is crushing Latin America and third world countries. And in the process, call for full participation by Japan and the other emerging economic powers. The second idea, my subject for today, is called the democratic workplace. It aims to create an explosion of productivity by giving every American worker a stake in our economic success. These ideas represent a new vision of the American economy. They can improve work and life for all Americans. They can make a better world. The starting point for all this change is the federal budget, because an economic policy is not what you say, it's what you do. What we've done in the last 6 years is this. We've created the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth largest federal budget deficits in American history. We're investing in deficits when we should be investing in education and science. We're raising real interest rates for farmers and small businesses when we should be lowering them to compete in world markets. And worst of all, we're stealing from the future when we should be assuring our children the opportunity for a better life. A lot of people have grown cynical about budget deficits because all they see is politicians pointing fingers. The president blames Congress. Congress blames the president. Both blame something called the budget process. But I don't think process is to blame. I think our leaders are to blame. Let's be honest. Does anyone really believe we can balance our budget with a sin tax or an oil fee? Is there one serious economist in the country who thinks we'll find a tenth of the answer in enforcement? I think the American people are ready for the facts. It's time to end the conspiracy of evasion by our candidates for national leadership. We've been dancing around the truth, nickel and diming the deficit with proposals that don't even scratch the surface of the problem. The plain fact is we need answers. We need to live in the real world of causes and consequences. And we have an obligation to take responsibility for our views. Now, as governor of Arizona, I balanced the budget 9 times in 9 years. The choices were sometimes difficult, but the arithmetic wasn't. If we want to get the federal budget under control, we have to do it the old-fashioned way. We'll have to cut spending and raise revenues. Why don't we just come out and say so? My first budget as president will cut spending and raise revenues. And I'll do both at once because I'll simply refuse to sign one bill without the other. To discipline government spending, I've previously called for a universal needs test. Every government expenditure, from farm programs to defense, should be targeted on some measure of real need. I don't think we need to pay subsidies to corporate mega farms. I don't think we need grants to finance parking lots for city hotels. I don't think we need to build 3 new kinds of missiles at once. And I don't think the Vanderbilts and the Mellons need exactly the same tax-free Social Security benefits as we give to a widow living in a cold water flat. That's what I mean by a needs test. I believe it will cut government spending and cut it fairly. Now, to raise the revenue that I have spoken of, I've considered and thought about several options, but I've concluded that it would be wrong to break faith with last year's tax reform, and I would not raise the income tax. Instead, I propose today a progressive national consumption tax. It should be broadly based so that the rate of taxation is held low. And it should be structured progressively, paid by those who can best afford it. Now, there are many ways to make this tax progressive, from income tax relief for working people to exemptions for food, housing, medicine. And I'm committed to working with Congress to ensure that it is a progressive tax. A consumption tax, even a very progressive one, would raise the revenue that we need for a serious attempt at deficit reduction. A 5% tax, for example, would generate $40 to $60 billion a year, depending on how it was structured. Would be simple and fair, no loopholes and no special breaks. Everyone pays it, and every transaction is taxed in the same way. It would be more progressive than the taxes we pay today, because the rich could not evade it, and the poor would be shielded from its impact. And it would help us make the shift from a debtor to an investor economy, an economy that leaves a legacy of opportunity, not just debt, for our children. Coming to grips with the federal deficit is an essential first step in creating the conditions for economic growth. But it's only a first step. The really big changes will have to come, in my opinion, in the way we're organized to do business in American society. Consider this. 3 out of every 4 American workers say that they don't do their best on the job, either in quality or in effort, and that if they did do their best, the company would do nothing to reward them. That attitude reflects an elemental fact about the old American workplace. Managers feel valued. Workers don't. American capitalism has too often regarded workers as drones, as costs to be minimized, and the managers only as the creators of value. Somehow we got the idea that innovation and company performance depends on a tiny elite core of highly paid executives, and that workers are just commodities. It's an absurd and pernicious idea, but we see it in industry after industry, with executives asking for givebacks on the shop floor at the same time that they're awarding themselves bonuses in the boardroom. We see it even more cynically in the widespread adoption of golden parachutes for top management. Golden parachutes are nothing more than cozy arrangements to pay enormous sums for failure. And to me, they symbolize everything that's wrong with the aristocracy of capitalism. The next president must lead us away from these practices and toward new ways of doing business. We must turn away from hierarchical and highly centralized models of management and toward models that put the power of decision in more hands. We must turn away from a concept of employees as costs, as commodities, and toward an understanding that they're among a company's most important assets. We must turn away, most of all, from an adversarial notion of management versus labor, and toward the idea that joint planning for mutual benefit works better. In this quest for a new democratic workplace, the next president must seek allies in forward-looking sectors of both labor and management. Because if America is to adapt successfully to a rapidly changing global economy, the democratic workplace must become the rule, and not just the occasional exception. We must have an economic environment in which labor and management can jointly pursue competitive success, sharing risks, responsibilities, and rewards. We must say to every worker, if you make first-rate efforts, if you pay attention to detail, if you improve the quality of your product, if you find a better way to do the job, you will have and share first-rate rewards. The democratic workplace of which I speak will not be handed down from on high. The American people must create it for themselves. One possibility is gain sharing, which rewards managers and workers alike by sharing increases in productivity and performance. Another possibility is profit sharing, which cuts workers directly into a portion of company profits. Still another is equity sharing, which lets every worker earn an ownership stake in the company. Now, workers in management must negotiate for themselves about what kind of performance should be measured, whose performance should be measured, and how. No one can legislate those decisions, but legislation can begin to establish the right environment. And as president, I would sponsor legislation for a democratic workplace aimed at several broad goals. First, pay for performance. Second, employee ownership. And third, strategic investments in people. I would advance these goals through the following specific proposals. 1, bonuses for all or none. No American company should be permitted to deduct an executive bonus as a business expense unless it offers some kind of performance pay for all of its employees. 2, golden parachutes. I would propose to prohibit severance packages of this kind, or at least restrict them to companies which are prepared to offer equivalent multiples of salary for every departing employee. 3, government loans and guarantees. Any direct government loan or guarantee to an individual company ought to be conditioned on a restructuring which creates partial ownership and partial control by the company's employees. 4, performance pay in federal contracts. The federal government, in my view, should experiment with direct performance bonuses for the employees of federal contractors who fulfill their contracts on time and under budget. 5, financing federal contracts. Where federal contracts call for asset financing, some proportion of that financing should be required to be undertaken through employee stock ownership plans, one which puts meaningful control of employee shares in the hands of employees themselves. 6, individual equity accounts. Workers who elect to take a fraction of their salary in company stock should be encouraged and entitled to create tax-deferred accounts with that stock until they sell it. The longer they hold the stock, the lower the rate of tax that they should pay at the time of sale. 7, worker training tax credits. The federal government creates tax incentives to invest in machinery and in research, but not in employee training and education. We should value investment in people at least as much as investment in technology, and we can do it with a tax credit for that training which exceeds a company's 3-year historical average. 8, child care vouchers. Most industrial nations have long since recognized that child care is critical to a productive workplace and that it is an expense of business and an important investment in our children. Ours has not. The lack of decent options is sharply reducing the employment, working hours, flexibility, and performance of at least half of all American workers. I think the time is at hand to create a uniform national child care voucher, scaled to income and funded directly by the federal government and the states. 9, portable pensions. A flexible workforce must be able to move, to change jobs, occupations, or employers without leaving behind the accumulated pension security. We should require any employee without an ERISA-approved retirement plan to withhold 2% of each employee's wages, then to match that with an additional 2% contribution, and thereby create a fully funded and portable pension which could be cashed out or moved whenever the worker changes jobs. This, then, is the democratic workplace. Bringing it about will be one of the central goals of my presidency. Performance pay, employee ownership, and strategic investments in our workforce would bring profound changes in the way we work and live in America. It would help create better motivated, more flexible, and more productive workers. And it would do much to ensure that America's success is shared equitably among those who create it. This is the workforce we need. This is the workplace of the future. And this is a model we can proudly display for other nations because this is capitalism at its best. America today faces an historic opportunity to take on the mantle of world economic leadership for the second time in this century. It's an opportunity, but it's also a test of whether our democracy is bold enough and flexible enough to change with changing times. We still have, as we've always had, a choice. We can opt for the known and the secure, ignoring the changes all around us, rejecting the opportunities that they offer. Or we can plunge ahead into the future, enlisting every American citizen in that journey. We can come to terms, after all these years of recklessness, with our national budget. We can build a democratic workplace that creates an explosion of productivity and growth. And we can once again become the engine of a prosperity that makes the entire world a better place. Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank the governor, and I just meant to tell him that the reason the introductory remarks were so slanted like that is that he raised the podium on me, as you can tell, and it's too far for me to see what I was saying. It was really a much more complimentary introduction.
You can read it now.
Oh, yes, sir. Yeah. All easy questions from here on in. How does the Central Arizona project come under the means-tested federal spending? After that one.
I think the day of the large reclamation project, 100% federal funded, is a thing of the past. It surely has, in large measure, fulfilled its function. That's the reason that many of us not only supported, but really pushed for this concept of cost sharing as a statement to Western states that the old days are gone. The Western states are now developed in reclamation, and the burdens of developing reclamation projects must now be initiated and borne by the states themselves. I'm the former governor of Arizona, by the way.
As a more politically digestible alternative to a national sales tax, would you consider a 50 cents a gallon gasoline tax, which would yield $50 billion to the Treasury and provide a powerful energy conservation incentive?
I'd like to meet the person who proposed that alternative. A gas tax is a narrowly focused sales tax, a consumption tax. I worry about whether or not it would be possible to deal with the regressive aspects of that tax. I think the burden might fall rather unevenly, and that there is a better economic case for spreading a consumption tax more broadly.
Isn't it almost more important to know how a presidential hopeful plans to organize the White House than what that candidate thinks about issues? Who would be your chief of staff, or do you plan to put together another form of structure to manage the administration? Please give us an idea of the way in which decisions will be made and policies implemented by President Babbit.
Sounds good. I would implement policies. By the way, whoever asked this question, I do think that presidential elections are about programs and directions, and that the hearings on Capitol Hill in the last couple of weeks give us ample reason to suggest that clear goals and policies, foreign policies and domestic policies, are at the very heart of American governance. Now, I concede that management is important, that the president should be awake, that he should hire staff who are accountable and who have a habit of passing information along and consulting. And I don't think there is anything structurally wrong with the organization of the executive branch of government. It requires, I think, a few basic things: hiring competent people, stating goals clearly. That's the reason for the chaos in the Middle East, the failures in Central America. We have a reactive foreign policy. It is not driven by values and goals. It is driven by a defensive, narrow view of the world, which seems to be premised on the idea that America is losing, that the tides are running against us, and that we must react by sending soldiers of fortune. It's not a foreign policy. My foreign policy would be based on a sense that America is winning, that the world is moving our way, that this global economy that I speak of is the fruit of American efforts, which should now be brought to fruition. Now, you then hire competent people and you hold them accountable. It's just that simple.
When you are elected President of the United States, would you be willing to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba, and for what reasons, yes or no?
I'm not prepared to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba. I believe the largest impediment between the United States and Cuba is the use of Cuban troops as mercenaries in Africa. I believe that the greatest danger of escalation in the third world is the use of proxy troops, and that we must have leadership to get at this issue and to find ways of stopping the degeneration of third world conflicts into proxy wars with soldiers of fortune acting as agents of the Soviet Union, and with an American response such as we see with the Contras in Nicaragua.
What do you think of a 3-day work week to cure unemployment?
I'm against it for the office which I seek.
You have sunk all your money and organization into Iowa. If you do poorly there, will you have the resources to keep going?
Yes.
Do you think AIDS will be a major campaign issue in 1988? How will you set yourself apart from other candidates and the Reagan administration in proposing solutions?
Yeah, I do think that AIDS will be a major issue. The geometric increase in cases, the continuing spread of the disease, I think, have not received enough attention. The issues, I think, are quite clear. Education and prevention must be at the top of the list. This administration doesn't seem to have the courage to step up front and speak plainly. The conservative government in Great Britain has mailed every household in that country with a simple elementary explanation of what's at stake for the lives of British citizens. We could mail every household in the United States for $20 million. Those costs would be recouped if you could prevent a couple thousand cases. It's a leadership issue of first importance. I didn't really understand the AIDS issue as an urgent issue until my fifth grader last fall came home with an assignment from his teacher to write about the causes and prevention of AIDS. And I turned to Hattie and I said, "What are they doing? What are they doing to my baby?" And she said, "Bruce, Christopher Babbit is not your baby. He's your pre-adolescent son, and it's your responsibility to start talking about these issues." And by the time it was all over, I had reason to be grateful for that teacher, and I think that illustrates the real urgency of all of us stepping up to talk. We're going to have to begin anticipating the catastrophic medical costs that will be involved and shaping.
Partly because,
And I think that illustrates the real urgency of all of us stepping up to talk. We're going to have to begin anticipating the catastrophic medical costs that will be involved and shaping both Medicare and Medicaid to meet the treatment costs as they begin to mount.
Governor, we've had quite a few questions about Latin America and Mexico, so I'll try to combine them and maybe you can take it from there, sir.
Okay.
You have been outspoken in criticism of Mexico's National Action Party operating on the border of your home state of Arizona. Can you comment on the changes, charges that some funds from Colonel North's fundraising efforts for the Nicaraguan Contras have also gone to this Mexican party? And then perhaps can you explore the possibilities of wider cooperation with Mexican politicians?
I spoke earlier of an administration with no foreign policy, an administration whose view of the world is that America is losing and whose vision extends to the next arms sale and the next crowd of soldiers of fortune. The most impressive example of that is Latin America. This administration is obsessed with Nicaragua, backing a policy that has no basis in law or morality or any real relation to American goals. They're backing a group of mercenaries who can't win. It's a slow-motion Bay of Pigs. They're obsessed with a country of 3 million people. Next door, right on our very border, is a country of 83 million people, and because they react only in a narrow way to crises, they have no policy at all with respect to Mexico. There are many people in Mexico who are starting to think that Jesse Helms is the President of the United States, because that's all they hear. And Mexico is on the verge of the greatest crisis in its constitutional history. The silence from the White House amounts to a statement that Mexico's destiny is to be left to the clerks in green eye shades and yellow pencils in the boardrooms of New York banks, trying to collect a debt that can't possibly be paid. I think the preferable alternative is to view that debt as the opportunity for a reverse Marshall Plan, not for sending more money, but for stanching the outflow of debt service before it sinks the countries, and using debt recomposition and reduction as an opportunity to construct growth policies that will provide markets for American products, enhance the national security of this hemisphere, and deal with a world which is coming our way, which needs a foreign policy that's based on economics, on development, on a larger vision, on providing what those people are looking for, which is not soldiers of fortune. It's American values and a new international economic order.
Governor, you mentioned this in this answer, so I'll ask them now. Should Congress approve $140 million in aid to the Contras?
No.
Okay. How would you approach the problem posed by the Sandinistas?
I'd approach the problem posed by the Sandinistas by attempting to define the problem. Now, I've spent some time in Nicaragua and spent my share of time talking with the leadership of the Sandinistas. They're not necessarily my kind of people, and I do think that there are mixed fruits of that revolution and that it could go off course. But I think we need to isolate America's specific interests. Certainly, the establishment of a Russian strategic base is inconsistent with our national interest. We should deal with the Russians on that score. The mutual security of the surrounding countries is an important American objective, Costa Rica, Honduras, and El Salvador. I should think that American foreign policy would begin, as I began a year ago, by buying a plane ticket to San Jose, Costa Rica, and asking the Costa Ricans what their view of the mutual security issue is. And we all know their answer. The President of Costa Rica has a 2-page peace plan. It could be read even in the basement of the White House. And it starts with the termination of aid to insurgents, including aid to the Contras. It recognizes that for better or for worse, the Sandinista government is in charge in Nicaragua and that the Contras have no support. Those are the guys they threw out. And the Costa Ricans say to us, we can take care of our future. There are no Sandinistas in Costa Rica. And if we need your help, we'll ask for it. But in the meantime, our interest in Costa Rica is served by terminating Contra aid. Now, I think from that you can infer that Mr. Abrams would be on a priority termination list in my administration.
Would the sales tax you propose apply anywhere before the retail point of sale, and what is your view of a value-added tax?
The consumption tax that I propose can be structured either to look like a sales tax applied at the point of sale, or more like a European-style value-added tax in which the tax is applied in increments prior to the point of sale. The important thing is the concept. The important thing is to understand that we must create real economic growth. We've got to tear up those mortgages on the future of our children. We have to begin to seize this opportunity for economic growth, for leading a world economy. And we've got to break the gridlock. We must have the courage to tell the truth that we can link together budget cuts and revenue increases. Will the American people buy that? I think there's a lot of common sense in this country, and that it's the leaders who are failing. My sense as I talk about this issue in Iowa, New Hampshire, and elsewhere is that Americans care about the future of their children. They understand that we can't continue simply to destroy the futures of our children and bypass the opportunities that are out there waiting to be seized. And that if we could structure a way of saying that tax increases and budget cuts will be linked together, and that they will be the prelude to real economic growth, but there's a lot of willingness out there. The question is whether or not leaders will lead and will speak the truth.
Governor Babbit, if you are nominated, your Republican opponent may be George Bush, who once attacked the voodoo economics of Ronald Reagan. Politics makes strange bedfellows. Might you and Bush end up agreeing on Reagan's voodoo economics?
We already do. At least this candidate does. The question is frequently asked. Does the 1984 campaign prove that Reaganomics is here to stay, that people are willing to just let the future fall from our grasp. I don't think so. I think there are a trillion reasons why 1988 is different from 1984, and they're in that budget deficit.
President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher are described by this questioner as being thick as thieves. As a Democratic president, would you seek to maintain the close and special relationship that exists between a U.S. president and a British prime minister, and would you ever consider launching an airstrike on another country from U.S. bases in England? So eased into that question, didn't they?
Yes, I would maintain a special relationship with the United Kingdom, even with a conservative government. They've been an important part of our success in Europe, and I have no reason to think that that shouldn't continue. The answer is yes. Now, what was the second part of the question?
Would you ever consider launching an airstrike on another country from U.S. bases in England?
Well, let's see. I want to hear the president who says, I have an air base in another country with strategic and tactical airplanes, and I would never consider using them. Okay, next question.
I hope that person makes that statement here. That would be good. If you were elected President of the United States, would you recognize the sovereign right of the peoples of Latin America to choose their own form of government, even though it might be a socialist one?
Yes. This issue of the ideology of foreign governments is, I think, one that proceeds once again from this reactive kind of foreign policy, which says the world is headed against us. And every time we hear the word socialist, it's down to the basement of the White House to crank up a few soldiers of fortune and see if we can find some arms sales. We deal with Yugoslavia, with the People's Republic of China, with countries all over this world. The extraordinary fact is that all of those countries are headed our way. The evolution of the third world is really an extraordinary phenomenon. There's a reaching out for market economics, for new forms of economic integration, for democracy. And our interests are best served by encouraging that process, by looking beneath the labels, and by fostering in a positive way the kinds of changes that I think are sweeping this world, and which dictate that we reorder our economy in order to pick up the leadership role. This issue of workplace democracy is really deeply tied to the rest of the world, because we have two choices. One is to continue to pull up the drawbridges, to step back, to continue policies that are based upon fear and reaction and lack of confidence. The other one is to say we'll take it to full tide. It's out there waiting for leadership. And then to deal honestly with major changes in our own economy. We can't afford the status quo. It amounts to retreating to the sidelines and saying that the United States of America is content to sit on the bleachers of history. I think the preferable option is to step up to the issues of productivity, not by pulling up the drawbridge, not by building barriers and retreating, but by saying we need radical change in the American workplace. The old adversary relationships, the habits of 100 years are inadequate to the challenges of the present. And that is why the budget deficit is important. But it's only the first step, because the next step is to reorder the American workplace, to emphasize savings and investment, productivity, worker participation, to begin to make those investments in our children, beginning with preschool and daycare and early childhood, to position ourselves to step up and to meet this extraordinary global change and to help shape and lead it rather than simply walking away from it.
What makes a president with a background as governor better than one with senatorial experience? Our recent experiences have not been too encouraging.
In 1932, in the darkest hour of America's history, a governor from Albany, New York, came to this city and rescued the United States of America. That's just a way of saying that it's not the title on the door. You know, we're at a contest of resumes. I might consider sending a contribution to Alexander Haig.
How would you make your consumption tax progressive?
The consumption tax can be as progressive as one cares to make it. There are two ways of doing it, and my own suggestion is that we should look at both. One is to use the income tax return by expanding the personal deductions and the earned income tax credit, so that as an offset for paying a consumption tax, your income taxes in the lower brackets are correspondingly reduced. The other one, which has been used in some countries, is simply to exempt things such as food, medicine, clothing, housing, what have you. I think there's a strong case for either one of those, but the important thing is this. A consumption tax can be as progressive as you want to make it, and in the form that I propose would in fact be at least as progressive as the income tax, if not more so.
Would you apply your means test to cost of living adjustments for federal retirees and their beneficiaries?
No, I wouldn't. I think that the COLA changes that were made in the Social Security amendments of the early 1980s are adequate, and that the better way to focus entitlement programs is simply to say that we should select a threshold above which all government benefits are subject to taxation. It's a progressive concept. People say, well, what would you do with the savings? I can tell you what I do with them in the case of Social Security. I draw the tax revenues back into the Social Security Trust Fund and then use them to finance the expansion of Medicare. It's a way of paying for a change that we all know must come, and that is the expansion of Medicare to cover both catastrophic expenses and the beginning of a program for extended nursing care.
If elected president, would you revise the CIA, and do you favor abolishing it?
I'm thinking of how do you revise the CIA? What would we do? No, seriously, I think the most important structural change that should come out of these hearings is a clear understanding embodied in law that the National Security Council will not be under any circumstances, anytime, anywhere, an operative agency. Among the many evasions and violations of the law, surely one of the most regretful was the corruption of the National Security Council into a substitute for the CIA in order to make an attempt to subvert the Boland Amendment. National Security Council should be restricted to the gathering and collating of intelligence as a form of service and advice to the President. And it's a regretful fact that covert activities are a part of reality, even in a democratic society. The CIA is the appropriate place to do that. And the question then becomes accountability to the Congress. I don't know how it's possible to pass a law to force a president to do what he is required by law to do. This president simply chose to break the law. I would, if elected, obey the law. The great successes in American foreign policy, the starburst of activity after World War II, all the way up into the 60s, were premised on presidential understanding that foreign policy requires the cooperation and advice and consent of the Congress. the extraordinary creations of the post-war world, the trading order, the bank, the IMF, the regional security agreements, the beginning of world integration, all took place because President Truman had the courage and the skill to go to Senator Vandenberg and say, we're in this together. It was followed by President Eisenhower, who had the wisdom and the understanding of the American constitutional system to go to Lyndon Johnson and, in that case, Democratic leaders, and to forge an alliance in the formation of American foreign policy. Think what would have happened if this president had chosen to fulfill his constitutional responsibility to consult with the Congress. What do you think would have happened if he had called a few of the leaders over and said, by the way, I'm thinking of sending a couple thousand TOW missiles to the Ayatollah for some hostages? What would have happened? We might have saved ourselves this incredible agony. And what would have happened if the President of the United States had had the integrity to honor the law and to call in the appropriate congressional leaders and say, I have a lieutenant colonel named Oliver North, and we intend to subvert the Boland Amendment by hiring soldiers of fortune, by sending arms merchants around the world in the name of the President of the United States. It might not have happened, and that's the reason for that congressional process. It's a part of the American constitutional system, and it ought to be honored for the good of America.
Governor, before I ask you the final question, I'd like to present to you this paperweight, National Press Club paperweight, which you can throw at me afterwards for the introduction. And also, believe it or not, a certificate of appreciation before appearing here.
Don't read it.
Our final question today, sir, is now after your VIP reception, National Press Club lunch, long introductory speech, and questions, what advice do you have for Pat Schroeder?
Have somebody else introduce her. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This concludes today's National Press Club luncheon.